Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank Danny and Carole Phillips and congratulate them on their new grandson. Congratulations. I'll give you actually an old rabbinic blessing. Why not? I'm here, and you probably don't hear that many old rabbinic blessings. So there is a rabbinic story that when God decided to bless Abraham, he couldn't decide how to bless him. And they said by analogy, it's like a man who's wandering for many days and he comes upon an oasis in the desert. And he sits at the tree and he drinks from the stream and he sits in the shade. And as he's leaving, he looks back at the tree and he says, I want to bless you for everything you did for me, but I don't know how to bless you. I could bless you with abundant shade, but you have that. And I could bless you with deep roots, but you have those. And I could bless you with water, but you have water. So the only way I can bless you is to say, may all who come from you be like you. So may all who come from you be like you, and blessings to your grandson. I also want to I did really enjoy the singing, but I want to offer one copyright edit. At the very beginning, when you said, this is the day the Lord has made, Zeh hayom asa Adonai, at the end of the song, which was extraordinarily beautiful, and I did love the singing, it said, words and music by Rob Sill, 2002. Now, since I'm here on behalf of King David, I just want to say, I'm sure somewhere he's complaining about copyright infringement. But other than that, it was great. So my father was a rabbi in Philadelphia, and he always took his watch off before he spoke. And I have adopted that habit, and I once asked him why, and he said, I'll tell you why. My father answered everything with a story. He said, a man once came to synagogue, and he brought his friend who wasn't Jewish, and he said, don't worry, I'll explain everything that goes on. So they opened the ark. He explained what the ark was. They took out the scroll, the Torah. He explained what that was. The rabbi gets up to speak, and he takes his watch off. The man says, what does that mean? He said, that doesn't mean anything. So please don't be too excited by this. It's just pro forma. But I am excited to speak about David because not only did I have the opportunity to write about David, who obviously my parents reached back for my own name of David, but also because David is the most fascinating figure in the Hebrew Bible. I don't think anyone else comes close, and we know more about David than anyone else. Even though more, probably in quantity of words, is written about Moses, you don't get the same depth of characterization. And so before I begin talking about David, one caveat again in the form of a story about a rabbi and a doctor are having a conversation, and the doctor says, you know, Rabbi, I don't mean to brag, but I want you to know that sometimes I treat patients for free. The rabbi thinks for a minute. He goes, I do that. The doctor says, well, when I write them prescriptions, I sometimes subvent the prescriptions on my own so that they don't have to pay anything and they can get whatever medicine they need without charge. The rabbi thinks for a moment. He goes, yeah, I do that. Now the doctor's getting frustrated. He says, well, when I do surgeries, I make sure that the hospital doesn't charge them over above what the insurance will pay so that people who are indigent and who are poor can get surgery for free. The rabbi thinks for a minute. He goes, yeah, I do that. The doctor says, Rabbi, all due respect, you don't have patients, you don't write prescriptions, and you certainly don't do surgery. And the rabbi said, oh, no, I mean, I say nice things about myself too. So I'm about to talk about David. And every page I wrote of the book, when I kept writing, David does this and David is that, When I gave it to the first friend who read it in draft, they would write sometimes on the side, "Is this about you?" And I want you to know that it isn't, but it is, in the sense that every biblical character is a mirror. We always see ourselves, otherwise we wouldn't read the Bible, because everything has changed since the time of the Bible, clothes and language and culture and history, except human nature. And so when we explore David, we are also exploring ourselves. And now the story. You get 3 separate introductions to David, and they actually are chronologically not possible to put in a logical sequence. They don't fit together. It's almost like 3 separate snapshots that tell you different things about David's character. So the first is when God tells Samuel, after Saul has lost God's favor, and we will come back to Saul in just a second, God tells Samuel, "Go off and anoint the new king." And here, by the way, Samuel says to God, I can't go off and anoint if Saul knows that I'm going to anoint the new king, he's going to kill me. And here God does something that I think every Bible reader should be aware of. He tells Samuel to lie. I think this is great, right? Even God knows human beings can't live with 100% honesty, you know? So when I say to you afterwards, "Did you like my talk?" God will forgive you if you say yes. He says, "Just go and say you're off to sacrifice." So Samuel does, and he comes to the house of Jesse the Bethlehemite. And Jesse has 7 sons, which biblically is the perfect number. And when Samuel asks him to present his son, he brings Eliab, who's this tall, handsome, strapping figure of a man. And Samuel is about to anoint him, and God says, "Pay no attention, I've rejected him." Because not as human beings see does God see. Ki ha'adam yir'eh la'enayim. People see what is visible, but God sees into the heart. So Samuel says, "Next, please." It goes on, all 7 sons, none of them is the new king. And Samuel says, "Are you sure you don't have any more kids?" And Eliab goes, "Oh yeah, there's the little one out back pasturing the sheep." He brings him in, he's young and ruddy-cheeked. God says, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Now remember, we're not only telling this story to find out about God, but about David. David is so neglected that his own father doesn't think to introduce him to the company. And it's not just any company, right? It's the leader of Israel who's come to his house. So you can imagine how David not only teaches the lesson of the least of us, but also David's own psychology, which plays in to who he becomes later. Because the second story is David and Goliath. And why does David come to the challenge of Goliath? It's because his father tells him, "The Philistines and the Israelites are fighting. I want you to bring food for your brothers." And he goes there, and he hears about this Philistine champion that has challenged anyone to fight him. And you may or may not know this, but one of the clues to biblical characters is to look at the first thing that they say. What is the first thing that David says? What will be given to the guy who defeats Goliath? Okay? Then he goes on to say, because he's insulted the God of Israel, and on and on and on, but that's not the first thing he says. And his older brother says to him, "What are you doing here, kid? You shouldn't be here." And David, I have 2 older and 1 younger brothers, so David, in the style of younger siblings forever and ever, says, "I'm not doing anything wrong." But then he finds out, in fact, that no one will challenge Goliath, not even Saul. the king of Israel, will challenge Goliath, and David does. And then there is this beautiful symbolic scene where Saul tries to outfit him with his armor, but David can't wear it because he's a kid. And he takes it off. And he says, look, I've defeated animals, wild animals, and I can do this, and they have no one else. Now, David and Goliath is supposed to be the story of an underdog. But if you read it carefully, David has a long-range weapon. And this is part of what David's greatest gift is in terms of being a king and a leader. He expands the possibilities. He sees the world differently from everyone else. When Goliath says, "Why are you coming at me with sticks?" you can imagine that David held his shepherd's staff because he wanted to deceive him into thinking that he thought he was going to beat him with a stick, which is ludicrous, but Goliath doesn't take him seriously anyway. And so David takes his sling, and by the way, as you can imagine, they have actually now done tests on Bedouin farmers in modern Israel, and yes, you can kill somebody with a stone, and they're incredibly accurate. And the reason, if you want to know, that, and this is a nice sidelight, that David was so skilled with a slingshot is that shepherds would vary sometimes the number of sheep that they had from day to day. Sometimes you go out with 10 sheep, sometimes with 30. And so you would keep the number of stones in your sling as sheep that you had to care for. So shepherds always had stones and slings and a lot of time on their hands, right? That's why, by the way, as a sidelight into a Jewish custom, sometimes you will go to Jewish graves and you'll see stones on the grave. One of the beautiful traditional explanations is you ask God to keep the soul of the person like a stone in the sling of a shepherd. So David had done this a lot. And when he came against Goliath, he knew exactly what he was doing. And he lodged a stone and killed him and cut off his head, and thereby became effectively already the hero of Israel, even as a child. The third story is when Saul. Now, let me just say, I'm not a psychologist. It's very hard to psychoanalyze people. I mean, think of it this way. When you read a biography about somebody, imagine how well your best friend would describe your love life. And when you realize how many mistakes your best friend would make, you realize it's very hard to know yourself, to know your best friend, and to write a book about somebody that you never even met is hubris, right? So I wasn't even writing the book about Saul, and I'm not a psychoanalyst, but Saul was a manic depressive. Just wild guess here. That is, according to the Bible, he had periods, I mean, it almost is like it's describing bipolar. He had periods of mania, and he had periods of deep depression. And his coterie of assistants solicit David to come and play music for him, to lift him out of the doldrums. And Saul, interestingly, doesn't seem to know, neither at the incident with Goliath, nor when they bring David into the house, Saul doesn't seem to know who he is. So part of this could be Saul's problem, but part of it is this extraordinary continuity in David's life, from his father forgetting him to his substitute father not paying attention to him. And you know that sometimes neglect defeats you, and sometimes it gives you this incredible drive to distinguish yourself and prove that even though maybe nobody paid attention to you when you were little, the world is going to hear from you now. And one thing that seems very clear about David is that he was a driven and ambitious man. Because when he comes into Saul's house, there are essentially three powerhouses. There's Saul, there's Saul's heir apparent to the throne, Jonathan, and there's Saul's daughter, Michal. And one by one, they all fall in love with David. Every one of them. Now, you can explain this by David's just a very lovable character. Or you can also explain it, or since a lot of things have more than one explanation in terms of human behavior, you can explain it as well as David knew how to make himself loved, because the Hebrew name David means beloved. And beloved people not only are naturally lovable, just among us, they also know how to be lovable, right? You can't go through life being loved and not say, when I do this, people love me. So David is loved by Saul, who also bears a murderous rage against him, but we'll get back to that in a second. Sometimes those two things are not incompatible. He's loved by Michal, who not only loves him and marries him, but loves him so much that she saves his life from her blindly jealous father, and is loved by Jonathan. Now, whether the love of David and Jonathan was sexual or not sexual, the answer is the Bible actually doesn't say. It just doesn't say. I think you can make a case both ways, and I'm happy to make the case both ways if anybody is interested. But for the moment, what is relevant is less the nature of the love than the fact of the love. Then the truth is that David, everywhere he goes, manages somehow to capture people's hearts. And even though you can do that a little bit artificially, in the end, if you live with people and they love you, there's got to be something about you that evokes that love. And remember that it wasn't just David, Jonathan, Michal. That is, by the way, the first, later on, Abigail, who I will come back to. It's also the truth that the people of Israel loved David. And that wasn't said about Saul. And that wasn't even entirely true, in a certain sense, about Moses. The people revered Moses, but David evokes love in a different way. And so we here have this character who is on this remarkable trajectory. And not only is David loved, but David does something that is really unusual among the men of the Bible. I won't say among men in general, I'll let you decide. Which is, David listens to women. He really listens. Maybe this is part of why he's beloved. Not only does David listen to Michal and allow Michal to rescue him, which she does, but later on, when David meets Abigail, who is, by the way, good trivia question, the first and perhaps only woman in the Bible who is called intelligent before she's called beautiful. Yes, exactly. But also, Abigail gives the longest speech in the Hebrew Bible that is given to a woman addressed to a man. David not only doesn't interrupt her, but he listens to the entire speech and changes his behavior because of what Abigail says to him. This is unusual. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. It's unusual. And it shows you that David, who is ambitious and a warrior and masculine and gets the loyalty of a band of outlaws, because that's essentially what they were, who traveled with him and who ran a protection racket. That's basically what he did. I mean, look, I defended him on copyright, but But the man ran a protection racket. He said, to people, we will protect you. That's what he was trying to do with Abigail's husband, Nabal. He said, I will provide protection for him if he feeds my soldiers and so on and so on. Nabal wants no part of it. David wants to kill him. Abigail tells him not to, but because he's David, God conveniently does the job for him. Nabal somehow wakes up dead. And nonetheless, despite David's hyper-masculinity, he has this relationship of attention and of care with women that is unusual, and even his falling out with Michal is because David danced before the people, which she found undignified. But David had a joy and a sort of heedlessness about the normal dignities that was, I'm sure, part of the reason why he was so beloved. Having said that, David, like a lot of successful people, was more successful in the world than he was at home. And David's domestic life, which again is more detailed than anyone else in the Bible, is worth noting, not only because it says so much about David and about redemption, but also because it teaches us a lot about ourselves. David, after all, has as his first family people that don't pay attention to him, and as his second family, this very ambiguous family of Saul, who hates him, who wants to kill him, who loves him and weeps and apologizes for trying to kill him, but eventually chases him all over Israel, so much so that David has to run away to Philistine territory because he can't live in Israel because Saul will kill him. Then Saul himself is killed in battle. I'm skipping a lot, but I'm giving you the highlights. Saul himself is killed in battle. I should say that David has a remarkable knack of having his enemies killed while he's somewhere else, right? It's extraordinary. It happens like 5 or 6 separate times. And then when the people who kill the enemies come to David and say, look what I did, I killed your enemy, he says, how could you do that? Right? Terrible, terrible that you did that. So he's off in the land of the Philistines, right, in what is now Gaza, while Saul back in Israel is being killed. And Jonathan, who is Saul's heir apparent, dies in the battle as well. And then at the opening of 2 Samuel, because all of this is in the book of Samuel, just a word about that. The book is usually named after the first few words or the first character. That's why it's called Samuel, because the first 13 chapters are all about Samuel. And the reason there's Samuel 1 and 2 is not because the division is so natural, but because scrolls get unwieldy, right? They can only be so big. So when the book is too long, rather than have a gigantic scroll, you have scroll 1 and scroll 2. It sounds vaguely like Dr. Seuss, but that's Samuel 1 and 2. So at the beginning of Samuel 2, David has this beautiful eulogy for Jonathan, right? Where he says, by the way, his love for me was greater than the love of women. And again, can be seen in different ways. One is he could actually be making the distinction for you and be saying the love of women, although you might think that's the greatest love, this friendship was greater than that. Because remember, although today we don't do it, in Western history, speaking romantically about friendships was not a rare trope. It was very common. Just look back, Damon and Pythias, look at Shakespeare. Male friendships were often spoken of romantically, or he could be speaking romantically. I mean, you decide, whatever you like. But now the way is completely clear for David to be king. And so he goes back to Israel in virtual triumph. And he's now king of Israel. And we all know what pride goes before. Pride goes before a fall. And David has achieved everything that he wanted. He's loved of Israel. He's the hero of Israel. And then there is that ominous line. It says, "It's spring, the time when kings go to war." By the way, the reason kings go to war in spring is, first of all, the ground is hard. It's hard to go to war when the ground is soft because horses don't ride well. And there's a lot of fruit and other things on the trees so soldiers can be fed. That's why spring is the time to go to, just in case. Spring is the time to go to war. Not in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles we don't have seasons. This is, by the way, completely irrelevant, but I have a captive audience. So this is Los Angeles' great problem, right? Growing up in Philadelphia, I will now tell you what's wrong with Los Angeles, because I've been here for decades, so I almost am a native. The problem with Los Angeles is there's no fall here, no autumn. And the reason that's a problem is when you grow up in autumn, you realize that the process of getting older is beautiful. In Los Angeles, it's spring, 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 spring until you die, right? So you have to be 20 for 80 years, and then you die. But the idea of getting older is actually natural in most of the rest of the world. Just thought I would mention that. So David, it's spring, the time when kings go to war, and it says, "And David was walking on the roof of the palace." Already, the artistry is apparent. That is, if it's the time when kings go to war, and Israel is at war, what's David doing at home in the palace? Other than he's decided it's time for the troops to take care of our enemies. I'm going to stay here and enjoy my triumph. And of course, that's when he sees Bathsheba, or Bathsheba, depending on. Now, one of the things that I realized in writing the book, which I'd never thought of before, and I didn't really see any commentary about, although you can never say there is no commentary about, right? Because nobody could read all the commentary that exists in all the traditions on one verse, much less on one book. But I didn't see anyone mention the fact that if David could spot Bathsheba nude bathing on a roof, they must have been fairly close, right? He couldn't see her miles away. So David is looking at Bathsheba bathing nude on a roof nearby. Now, again, whether Bathsheba knew that the king walks on the roof at 2 p.m, or she didn't know, I don't know. All I do know is, whatever you think about Bathsheba's conduct, there is a clear power disparity here. And when they introduce Bathsheba, they say, daughter of so-and-so and wife of so-and-so, as in, this woman is really taken. And David summons her. He summons her, he sleeps with her. Throughout all of this, by the way, again, the artistry of the Bathsheba says nothing, not a word. She's completely silent. The first words she speaks are the note that she sends to the king, "I'm pregnant." Okay? Now, this is obviously the great crisis so far of David's life. What does he do? He summons Uriah home, Uriah being Bathsheba's husband. And Uriah is a Hittite. He's not an Israelite. So one of the things that you know is, however he behaves, you expect that he's not going to behave up to the standard of an Israelite. Because he's one of the tribes that dwells in Israel, maybe are allied with Israel, maybe will be in the army, but he's not an Israelite. And yet, as we discover, he is far more moral than the king of Israel. So David says to him, so how's it going out there, at the war? And he gives a report, and he says, good to see you, glad you're home, give you a little leave, go home, sleep with your wife. Uriah says, how could I do that? When my Lord's troops are out there fighting, I can't go home and sleep with my wife. And now David has a problem. He happened to have slept with the one moral guy's wife, and he doesn't know what to do. So he gets him drunk. And after he's drunk, he says, now go home and sleep with your wife, for God's sakes. He doesn't say for God's sakes, but I'm ad-libbing. And Uriah says, no, I won't do it. And then David commits the most cynical act of brutality in the entire Bible. He writes a note to Joab, the head of his troops, who's another fascinating character, and says, put this guy on the front line so that he dies. Seals it and gives it to Uriah. And says, when you go back, give this to Joab. Now, what we don't know, what we can't know, is did he contrive somehow to read the note and deliver it anyway, or suspect what the note said? I don't know. But he gives it to Joab, who reads it, does what he says, sends a note back, and tells David that the deed was done. Now, one thing that you realize is it doesn't entirely get David off the hook anyway, right? Because now Bathsheba's pregnant, and unless she cooperates and says, oh, my husband came home, it's still going to be David's kid. But it never gets that far, because now Nathan comes to David. And Nathan is a prophet in Israel, about whom we know very little, although I have some speculation. And he comes to David and he says, once there was a rich man, and he had lots of flocks and herds, and there was a poor man who had one lamb. And the rich man had some guests, and he took the lamb from the poor man, slaughtered it, and served it for dinner. What should be done with such a man? And David says, such a man deserves to die. And Nathan said, you are the man. You realize what Nathan has done. He's given David the chance to say how immoral he was. Rather than saying to him, what you did is terrible, he gives David the opportunity to condemn himself out of his own mouth. And once he does that, David has his finest moment by what he doesn't do. What David doesn't do is say, off with Nathan's head. Because in the ancient world, that's what kings did. They could do whatever they wanted. There was no restraint on a king. And David could easily have done that, and he could have survived it, and he could have lived with it, and he probably still would have been kings of Israel. If you read the book of Judges, you see how many, and the book of Kings, how many kings of Israel were not in any way redemptive figures. But instead, David repents. And he has that moment of grace that elevates him above his gifts and his talents and expresses his soul. It's important to know, though, that the story doesn't end there. And the reason that it's important is because, at least as I read the Bible, grace is not something that is earned once and forgotten. David goes back to the home that he has completely destroyed. And his oldest son, Avshalom, whom he has neglected, rebels against him. And this is because Avshalom is upset. Avshalom's half-brother, Amnon, because remember, David's had several wives. His half-brother has raped his full sister, Tamar. And Avshalom, I am again abbreviating the story, kills Amnon, kills his half-brother. And you wonder, through all this, where's David? And the answer is, absent. He's not there. He learned absence at his father's knee, so to speak, and now he is an absent father, and in time, Avshalom comes and rebels against him. And the reason that this is so powerful is also one of the two animating questions for me in this entire book. The thing that I started out with was, one, can David love? And two, why does he get to be the ancestor of the Messiah? Here's a guy who's an adulterer, who's a murderer, and he's the one that God chooses to be the ancestor of this. It doesn't make any sense. There are more enviable characters that you could pick. And again, it says, when David talks about Jonathan, he doesn't say, I loved him. What does he say? Your love was dearer to me than the love of women. It says the people loved David, Michal loved David, Saul loved David, Jonathan loved David. It never says David loved them. So I wonder, can David love? And then you come to the story of Avshalom, who is his son who rebels against him. And he says to Joab, whom you might remember from the guy who made sure Uriah was killed, right? The head of David's troops. He says to him and the other heads of the troops, go out and put the rebellion down. But whatever you do, do not touch a hair of Avshalom's head. Right? Avshalom, who, by the way, was known for his luxuriant hair and but accompanying ego. And what happens? What happens is, of course, as you know, the Bible loves the almost mythologically, you get hoisted by your own petard, and Avshalom got hung up by his hair. He's riding through a thicket, and he gets hung up by his hair, and he's hanging there helpless. And this guy comes to Yoav and says, oh my God, Avshalom's over there hanging helpless. And Yoav says, why didn't you kill him? And he says, well, you heard what David said. Remember, Yoav is a general, right? He doesn't care what David says in terms of David's softness of heart. So he runs over, and he stabs Avshalom and kills him. Then he goes back, and David hears the news that Avshalom has died, and there is that heartbreaking scene when you realize that actually David can love. Avshalom, Avshalom, he says, like Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, the Sutpen family being a sort of southern Gothic version of the David story. And he is heartbroken, and he weeps, and he says, you know, better you should have taken me than my son. And then there is this remarkable scene that tells you how realistic the book of Samuel is. Joab comes to David, and he says to him, cut it out. Stop it. Because there are all these men out there in your army who were willing to give their lives to put down the rebellion for the guy that you're crying about. And if you want to have an army tomorrow, you better stop mourning for the guy that was killed today. And that's where David shows himself more of a king than a father, because he pulls himself together, and he goes and greets his troops. And in that moment, you see the inevitable contradiction, or tension at the very least, between the world as you have to be if you're a leader and the home that you have to tend to if you're a person. And that it puts almost unbearable tension on David, which leads to the last scene. David has now been king of Israel, and he has achieved maybe the most remarkable thing that he has done in his life, which is he's about to die in his bed, right? Which is, for a king, an achievement, right? King Louis XIV said, better I should be killed by my enemies than my children. Because that's what happened to kings, right? You've all read the stories, seen the movies. David's about to die in his bed, and Solomon is going to be his heir apparent. Now, after this long drama, and really, this sounds ridiculous, I cannot urge you enough to read Samuel 1 and 2, because the story is even more fascinating and dramatic than I've had a chance to convey. You think David's going to give some beautiful, uplifting speech to Solomon. He's going to say, walk in the ways of God, my child, and be faithful and wholehearted. No. He says, listen, this guy who betrayed me, and I promised I wouldn't kill him, Solomon, you know what to do. That's what he says. It's the last speech of the Godfather was modeled on this. I have no doubt about that, right? He even says, this guy who did me a good turn, make sure he's taken care of. And then the Hebrew, in a very beautiful twist, tells us the following. At the very end of the book of Samuel, at the very first chapter, rather, of the book of Kings, it says, now King David was old, advanced in years. The second chapter, it says, now David was dying. So listen to the difference. King David was old. David was dying. Because when you're dying, you don't die as a king, right? You die as a person. It's true whether you're a doctor or a priest or a rabbi or whatever. When you die, it's just the human being before God. And so David before God wants to make sure, as every father would, that his son is safe. And so really, it is consistent with David's character and almost with his mission to tell Solomon, these are the enemies you have to watch out for. Forget nice platitudes. I want you to survive as a king. So watch out for this guy, and take care of that guy. And you may know that Solomon's brother was his rival for the kingship, and in true David fashion, it took him a little while, but eventually he eliminated him too. And so I came to the end of the book and I said, not the book of reading, when I was writing it, and I said, okay, so why David? Why does David get to be the progenitor of the Messiah? It's not who any of us would pick. Right? And there are lots of reasons given by the tradition. Right? One is you could just say, well, that's how it turned out historically, but that's not good enough for us, right? And you know that the longest genealogy in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament is the genealogy that ties Jesus to David, because you have to show that he came from David. The other is that David was the one who united the kingdom, who founded Jerusalem, among his greatest achievements, who wrote the Psalms. So he was religiously such an important figure, but even that doesn't feel like that means he should get to be the Messiah, the person who is the ancestor of the Messiah, when God, remember, wouldn't even let David build the temple. David asked to build the temple, and God said, you have blood on your hands. I don't want you building my temple. So I came up with my own theory, which really came out of the verse where God says to David, you are a man after my own heart. And I thought, what could that possibly mean? Does that mean that God likes murder and adultery? Of course not. What does it mean you're a man after my own heart? And I grew up in a tradition where essentially, because God's complicated, would require a whole nother lecture, but essentially, God is everything. In a very real sense, it's not that we are identical to God, but that everything that exists in some way is willed by or participates in whatever God is. So who best represents God in this world as a model? The human being who is the most comprehensive expression of what it is to be human. And David was everything. Yes, he was a murderer and an adulterer. He was also a poet and a warrior and a sibling and a father and a lover and a listener and a friend and a founder and a creator and every single thing that you could be in the ancient world. An underdog and a leader. A child that we experience, and an old man whom we see and listen to pass away. Every human experience that you could have and record in the ancient world, all of it is summed up in one character, which may be why he's called beloved. Because the truth is, as human beings, there is some part of us that loves everything human, that is attached to everything human. And when we see someone who is this fullest expression, we understand why redemption can't come from half a person. Redemption has to come from the full expression of the human heart, which, as you know, includes all things, black and white, good and bad, top, bottom, side to side, creative, mundane, sacred, profane, everything is summed up in the heart. And everything that was summed up in the human heart finds its expression in this one remarkable figure. And so, as I finished, I thought it makes sense that David is a man after God's own heart. Because David is a kind of expression of all of our hearts, the best parts and some of the worst. And that's why we need a David, and that's why we need a God, and that's why we pray that one day the worst will be gone and we will all be redeemed. Thank you.